Emani Moss. A cry ignored, a life lost. Emani was more than just a name in a case file. She was a little girl with a bright smile and sparkling eyes that always lit up with joy. Her teachers remember her as a bright and inquisitive student who especially loved art class. During recess, Emani would often play jump rope with her friends, her laughter echoing across the playground. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian so she could care for animals. But those dreams were tragically cut short. How did a 10-year-old girl, once full of hope for a better life, become the victim of a heinous crime within the very walls of her own home? This is the haunting question that lingers in the wake of Emani Moss's tragic story. A story that shocked a community, devastated a family, and exposed glaring flaws in the systems meant to protect our most vulnerable. Emani Moss was a bright and hopeful child, born into a world where love and care should have been guaranteed. Like any young girl, she had dreams, joys, and the innocent belief that her family would always keep her safe. But the reality of her life was far from what she deserved. In 2013, at just 10 years old, Emani's life came to a horrifying end, leaving behind questions about how such a tragedy could unfold and what could have been done to save her. Emani lived with her father, Emani Moss, who had custody after her biological mother lost parental rights due to drug addiction. For a brief time, her life seemed to stabilize. Emani loved school and had a radiant personality that drew people toward her. But her world changed drastically when her father married Tiffany Moss, a woman who initially appeared kind and nurturing but would later reveal a darker, crueler side. What makes Emani's story so heart-wrenching is not only the abuse she suffered but also the numerous warning signs that went ignored. Teachers, school nurses, and even neighbors noticed bruises, unusual behavior, and signs of neglect. Emani herself confided in trusted adults about her fear of returning home. Despite these cries for help, the system failed her at every turn. Reports to Child Protective Services, CPS, were dismissed or mishandled, and Emani was repeatedly returned to a home where she faced ongoing harm. The abuse escalated over time. Tiffany Moss, who was once a teacher entrusted with shaping young lives, used her position of authority in the family to isolate and control Emani. Physical punishment turned into calculated neglect. Tiffany withheld food, restricted Emani's movements, and made her a prisoner in her own home. By the end, Emani was a shadow of her former self, malnourished and too weak to fight back. The consequences of this neglect were catastrophic. On October 28, 2013, Emani Moss was found dead, her body burned in an attempt to cover up the abuse. The sheer cruelty of the crime shocked the nation and drew widespread media attention. Yet, behind the headlines was the story of a child who had been let down by everyone around her, her family, her community, and the systems designed to protect her. Emani's death is a stark reminder of the devastating impact of child abuse. Research shows that children who experience prolonged neglect and abuse often suffer from long-term physical, emotional, and psychological consequences. These include developmental delays, chronic health issues, and difficulties forming healthy relationships. For Emani, these consequences culminated in the ultimate tragedy. Her life was cut short. Her story also raises critical questions about accountability. How did so many warning signs go unnoticed or unaddressed? Why did the very systems designed to intervene in such situations fail so completely? And what can be done to prevent another child from enduring the same fate? The answers lie in both systemic reform and cultural change. Communities must foster environments where children feel safe to speak up, and adults must be vigilant in recognizing and responding to signs of abuse. Schools, social services, and law enforcement agencies need better training, resources, and coordination to ensure that no child slips through the cracks. Emani's story is not just a cautionary tale. It is a call to action. It challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truths about how society often overlooks its most vulnerable members. It implores us to demand better from our institutions and ourselves. And it reminds us of the dire consequences when we fail to protect those who cannot protect themselves. As we explore the details of Emani Moss's life and the events leading to her tragic death, let us remember that her story is not just about loss, but also about the urgent need for change. Every child deserves a chance to grow, thrive, and live free from fear. Emani's voice may have been silenced, but her story continues to speak volumes about the work we must do to ensure that no child is ever forgotten. The background of the case. Emani Moss's life began with challenges, but also with hope. Born on April 23, 2003, she was a child who radiated innocence and promise. Her father, Emani Moss, was awarded custody of her after her biological mother lost parental rights due to substance abuse. Emani worked hard to provide for his daughter, but as a single parent, his limitations soon became apparent. Despite these challenges, Emani thrived for a time, excelling in school and forming bonds with those around her. Her smile was contagious, and she carried a light that brightened the lives of others. The turning point in Emani's life came in 2009, when her father married Tiffany Moss. Initially, this seemed like a positive development. Tiffany, a schoolteacher, appeared to bring stability and maternal care into Emani's life. Neighbors and acquaintances described her as polite and composed, someone who might have been a positive influence in the household. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy lurked a troubling reality. As the months turned into years, cracks began to appear in the Moss household. Tiffany's demeanor toward Emani shifted. What had initially seemed like strict parenting revealed itself as something far more sinister. Witnesses noticed changes in Emani's behavior and appearance. Once lively and outgoing, she became withdrawn and subdued. Her once radiant smile dimmed, and her interactions with others grew more guarded. It was evident that the environment in the Moss home was not nurturing but toxic. By 2010, the first significant red flags began to surface. Teachers and school nurses noticed bruises and welts on Emani's body. She hesitated to provide explanations, but eventually confided in a school nurse that she was afraid of going home. Emani's fear was not unfounded. She described punishments that went far beyond discipline. One such incident involved Tiffany using a curtain rod to strike her, leaving visible marks. These revelations led to Tiffany's arrest and a charge of first-degree child cruelty. While this seemed like a turning point, the outcome of the case would set the stage for more tragedy. Tiffany was sentenced to probation under Georgia's first offender program. She lost her teaching job but avoided jail time. More alarmingly, after completing mandated parenting courses, she and Emani were allowed to regain custody of Emani. For 6 months, Emani had lived with her maternal grandmother, Robin, during Tiffany's legal troubles. Under Robin's care, Emani flourished. Her school performance improved, and her demeanor brightened. But this period of peace and growth was short-lived. Despite Robin's pleas to let Emani remain in her care, Emani was determined to bring his daughter back to the Moss household. When Emani returned home, the cycle of abuse resumed. Tiffany's treatment of her stepdaughter grew harsher. Reports of mistreatment trickled in, but little action was taken. Emani's extended family, particularly her grandmother and aunt, noticed her worsening condition. They observed her weight loss and her growing reluctance to engage with others. Emani's aunt, Sharon, even reported her concerns to Child Protective Services, CPS. However, CPS dismissed the case, citing insufficient evidence and deeming the household situation as stable. Isolation became a defining feature of Emani's life. Tiffany withdrew her from school in 2013, claiming she would homeschool her. This decision further severed Emani's ties to the outside world and eliminated a critical lifeline of support. Without teachers or peers to notice her suffering, Emani's vulnerability deepened. By the summer of 2013, she was rarely seen outside the confines of her home. Neighbors began to question whether the Moss family even had an older child, as Emani's presence became nearly invisible. The background of this case reveals a pattern of systemic failure. Despite multiple opportunities to intervene, the institutions tasked with protecting Emani fell short. The warning signs were evident: physical injuries, emotional withdrawal, and reports from concerned family members. Yet, time and again, these signals were overlooked or dismissed. Emani's story serves as a stark reminder of what happens when cries for help go unanswered. As we examine the events that led to the tragic culmination of Emani's life, it is crucial to understand the context in which she lived. The neglect and abuse she endured did not occur in isolation. They were enabled by a combination of individual actions and systemic shortcomings. The background of the case paints a picture of a young girl who deserves so much more than the hand she was dealt, and underscores the importance of vigilance and accountability in protecting children. The escalation of abuse and overlooked warnings. The abuse Emani Moss endured over the years did not occur in isolation, nor was it hidden. It unfolded in plain sight, surrounded by individuals and institutions that either failed to recognize the severity of the situation or chose to turn a blind eye. The events leading to her ultimate tragedy reveal a devastating pattern of escalation, systemic failures, and missed opportunities to intervene. The early warning signs. In the years following Tiffany Moss's marriage to Emani Moss, the dynamics within the household began to shift in troubling ways. Initially, Tiffany presented herself as a caring stepmother, but this facade quickly faded. By 2010, reports of mistreatment surfaced, primarily from teachers and school nurses, who noticed changes in Emani's demeanor and physical condition. Once a lively, engaged student, Emani became withdrawn, hesitant to speak, and visibly fearful. One of the earliest and most alarming incidents occurred when Emani confided in her school nurse. She expressed her fear of going home due to her stepmother's punishments. Emani described being struck with a curtain rod, which left welts and bruises across her body. The nurse documented these injuries, which were visible on her arms, back, chest, and legs. Despite this clear evidence of abuse, the system's response was shockingly lenient. Tiffany Moss was charged with first-degree child cruelty, but was sentenced only to probation under Georgia's first offender program. This allowed her to avoid jail time entirely. During Tiffany's probation period, Emani was placed in the care of her maternal grandmother, Robin. Under Robin's nurturing environment, Emani thrived. Her academic performance improved, and she regained some of her lost confidence and joy. However, this period of safety was short-lived. After 6 months, custody was returned to Emani and Tiffany Moss, despite Robin's pleas to keep Emani under her care. This decision marked the beginning of a darker chapter in Emani's life. The escalation of abuse. Once back in the Moss household, the abuse escalated. Tiffany's treatment of Emani grew harsher and more calculated. She not only inflicted physical harm, but also subjected Emani to emotional and psychological torment. Witnesses reported that Emani's demeanor changed drastically. The once vibrant and hopeful girl became reserved, visibly malnourished, and hesitant to engage with others. By 2012, Emani's attempts to escape her situation became more frequent and desperate. In one instance, she fled to the office of her apartment complex and begged for help. She recounted how Tiffany had restrained her with a belt and forced her into a freezing cold shower as punishment. Although police were called, Tiffany and Emani convinced the authorities that Emani's claims were fabricated. Without substantial evidence, Emani was sent back to her abusers. Another heartbreaking incident involved Emani being found sleeping outside in the shrubbery near her apartment complex. When questioned by a police officer, she revealed that she had run away because her stepmother was mistreating her. Instead of investigating further, the officer issued a citation for curfew violation and referred her to juvenile court. This blatant disregard for her cries for help underscored the systemic failures that repeatedly failed to protect her. Isolation and starvation. In 2013, Tiffany Moss took steps to isolate Emani completely. Claiming she would homeschool her, Tiffany withdrew Emani from school, cutting off one of the few lifelines the young girl had left. This decision removed any chance for teachers or school staff to observe and report signs of abuse. The isolation allowed Tiffany to escalate her control over Emani without fear of external scrutiny. Neighbors began to notice peculiarities. While Tiffany's biological children appeared well-fed, happy, and healthy, Emani's presence became almost non-existent. Some residents even reported that they were unaware an older child lived in the Moss household. This invisibility was a calculated move by Tiffany, who confined Emani to her bedroom for most of the day. The young girl was deprived of basic necessities, including food. Over time, the effects of prolonged starvation took their toll. Emani's physical condition deteriorated drastically. She became so frail and weak that she could no longer leave her bed. The once vibrant child was now a shadow of her former self, her body reduced to skin and bones. Tiffany, meanwhile, continued to feed and care for her biological children, blatantly disregarding Emani's suffering. Failures in the system. Throughout this time, numerous opportunities to save Emani were missed. Her grandmother, Robin, and aunt, Sharon, frequently raised concerns with Child Protective Services, CPS. They described Emani's deteriorating condition and pleaded for intervention. However, CPS often dismissed their reports as exaggerated or unsubstantiated, citing a lack of physical evidence. Despite clear signs of neglect and abuse, the agency deemed the Moss household functional and took no action. In August 2013, an anonymous report highlighted Emani's alarming weight loss and poor living conditions. This report was forwarded to Child Protective authorities, but once again, no meaningful action was taken. The excuse given was that the Moss family's frequent relocations made it difficult to investigate thoroughly. This bureaucratic failure left Emani trapped in an environment where her suffering only deepened. The tragic pattern. The escalation of abuse and the repeated dismissal of warnings illustrate a tragic pattern in Emani's case. Each missed opportunity to intervene allowed Tiffany Moss to exert greater control over Emani's life. The systemic failures, from law enforcement to child protection agencies, not only enabled the abuse, but also prolonged the young girl's suffering. Emani Moss's story is a harrowing reminder of the consequences of ignoring or dismissing signs of child abuse. Her attempts to seek help through teachers, neighbors, and even police officers were met with indifference or disbelief. The culmination of these failures serves as a sobering lesson about the importance of vigilance, empathy, and accountability in protecting vulnerable children. The final months of suffering. In the months leading up to Emani's death, the young girl's living conditions deteriorated drastically. Tiffany Moss, her stepmother, confined her to a small bedroom, isolating her from the rest of the family. While Tiffany's biological children received proper care and nourishment, Emani was deliberately starved. She was fed sporadically, often scraps or nothing at all, leading to severe malnutrition. Neighbors later testified that they rarely saw Emani, some not even knowing she lived in the household. By this time, Emani had grown so weak that she could barely move. Her once energetic spirit was replaced by a frail body unable to perform basic functions. Tiffany's cruelty extended to depriving Emani of even the most basic human dignity. She was left to fend for herself in squalid conditions, receiving no medical care despite her deteriorating health. The day of the tragedy. On October 28, 2013, Emani experienced a seizure, a direct result of prolonged starvation and neglect. Instead of seeking medical help, Tiffany and Emani Moss chose to ignore the severity of her condition. Emani later testified that he returned home from work to find Emani unresponsive in the bathtub. Despite this alarming state, Tiffany insisted that they not call for help, fearing legal repercussions. Over the next several days, Emani's condition worsened. She was left in her room without care, her body growing weaker by the hour. On the morning of October 28, Emani's life came to an end. Tiffany Moss's response to Emani's death was chillingly calculated. Rather than report her passing to the authorities, she devised a plan to conceal the crime. The attempted cover-up. In a horrifying act of desecration, Tiffany and Emani decided to dispose of Emani's body by burning it. Emani purchased a metal trash can, lighter fluid, and charcoal from a local store. That evening, the couple placed Emani's lifeless body into the trash can and attempted to incinerate her remains in a secluded area near their apartment complex. However, their efforts failed, as the fire did not completely destroy her body. Undeterred, they returned home with Emani's charred remains still in the trash can. The following day, Emani took the trash can, containing his daughter's body, to his workplace, leaving it in his car while he completed his shift. He later confessed this to a coworker, who urged him to contact the authorities. After hours of contemplation, Emani finally made the call. The discovery. When police arrived at the Moss household, they were met with a grim scene. Emani's remains were found in the trash can, her body charred but still recognizable. The officers immediately arrested both Tiffany and Emani Moss. The horror of the situation was compounded by the realization that Emani's death had been entirely preventable. The reaction. The discovery of Emani's tragic fate sent shockwaves through the community. Neighbors, teachers, and extended family members expressed their outrage and sorrow. Many questioned how such severe abuse could go unnoticed for so long. The case highlighted glaring gaps in the child protection system and sparked widespread calls for reform. The fallout. Emani's death marked the end of her suffering but began a long process of reckoning for those responsible. Tiffany Moss's calculated cruelty and Emani Moss's complicity brought to light the darkest corners of human behavior. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the details of Emani's final days painted a chilling picture of neglect, abuse, and indifference. The tragic climax of Emani Moss's story underscores the devastating consequences of failing to protect vulnerable children. It serves as a somber reminder that vigilance and compassion are not just virtues, but necessities when it comes to safeguarding the lives of the innocent. The investigation and trial. The investigation into Emani Moss's death revealed the horrifying extent of her abuse and neglect. As details of her final days emerged, law enforcement, medical experts, and prosecutors worked tirelessly to build a case against Tiffany and Emani Moss. The legal proceedings that followed exposed the systemic failures that allowed Emani's suffering to persist, and sought to hold her perpetrators accountable. The investigation? When Eman Moss finally contacted authorities on October 29, 2013, he claimed that Emani had died after ingesting a toxic substance and that he had attempted to dispose of her body out of fear. However, the police quickly saw through his story. The discovery of Emani's charred remains in a metal trash can on the family's property provided clear evidence of an attempted cover-up. Her condition, described by the medical examiner as skin and bones, highlighted the severe malnutrition she had endured. The medical examiner's report was critical in establishing the timeline of abuse. Emani weighed just 32 pounds at the time of her death, the average weight of a 3-year-old. Her shrunken organs and lack of body fat painted a clear picture of prolonged starvation. The autopsy concluded that she had died from neglect and malnutrition, further contradicting Eman's initial claims. Investigators pieced together Emani's tragic story through interviews with family members, neighbors, and school staff. Witnesses described her declining physical and emotional state, her withdrawal from school, and the isolation imposed by Tiffany. These accounts, combined with forensic evidence, created a comprehensive picture of the abuse Emani endured. The charges. Both Tiffany and Eman Moss were charged with multiple counts, including felony murder, first-degree child cruelty, and concealing a death. While Eman cooperated with investigators, providing detailed accounts of Tiffany's actions, his own complicity in the abuse was undeniable. Prosecutors offered him a plea deal in exchange for his testimony against Tiffany, which he accepted. Eman was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Tiffany Moss, however, refused to cooperate. She declined a plea deal that would have spared her the death penalty, and instead chose to represent herself in court. This decision would prove to be both controversial and pivotal in the trial's outcome. The trial. Tiffany Moss's trial began in April 2019 and quickly became a spectacle due to her decision to act as her own attorney. Despite being advised against it, Tiffany relied on court-appointed legal advisors to answer procedural questions, but did not actively present a defense. She declined to make opening or closing statements, failed to cross-examine witnesses, and offered no rebuttal to the prosecution's evidence. The prosecution presented a damning case against Tiffany. They called 18 witnesses, including Emani's grandmother Robin, her Aunt Sharon, former teachers, medical experts, and law enforcement officers. Each provided critical testimony about Emani's suffering, the abuse she endured, and the deliberate actions taken by Tiffany to isolate and starve her stepdaughter. The prosecution also presented photographic evidence of Emani's emaciated body, which left jury members visibly shaken. One juror was seen wiping away tears during the proceedings. The most chilling revelation came from Eman Moss's testimony. He described in detail how Tiffany controlled every aspect of Emani's life, her refusal to seek medical help, and the decision to burn Emani's body to hide their crimes. His account provided a first-hand look at the calculated cruelty that led to Emani's death. The verdict and sentencing. After just 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Tiffany Moss guilty on all counts, including malice murder, felony murder, and first-degree child cruelty. The evidence of her premeditated actions and utter disregard for Emani's life left no room for doubt. On May 1, 2019, Tiffany Moss was sentenced to death by lethal injection, becoming the first woman in Georgia in more than 5 years to receive the death penalty. The judge scheduled her execution between June 7 and June 14, 2019, though appeals have delayed this process. Eman Moss, while spared the death penalty, remains in prison, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His decision to testify against Tiffany was seen as a partial acknowledgement of his own role in Emani's suffering, though it did little to absolve him in the eyes of the public. Public reaction. The trial and its outcome sparked outrage and heartbreak across the nation. Advocates for child welfare criticized the systemic failures that allowed Emani's abuse to persist, and called for reforms in how such cases are handled. Community members mourned the loss of a young girl who was repeatedly let down by those who should have protected her. A legacy of lessons. The investigation and trial of Tiffany and Emani Moss serve as a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable children. Emani's story exposed the devastating consequences of ignoring warning signs and highlighted the need for stronger accountability within child protection systems. While justice was ultimately served, it came far too late for Emani, whose life was stolen long before her time. Aftermath and lessons learned. The tragic death of Emani Moss left a profound impact, sparking outrage and reflection within the community and beyond. Her story became a symbol of the systemic failures that allowed her abuse to go unnoticed and unaddressed for years. In the aftermath of her death, efforts were made to address the deficiencies in child protection systems and to honor the memory of a young girl whose voice was silenced too soon. Legal and familial consequences. Following the trial, the consequences for those involved in Emani's life were significant. Tiffany Moss was sentenced to death for her role as the primary perpetrator of the abuse and neglect that led to Emani's death. Emani Moss, who played a complicit role in the crime, received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The couple's biological children were removed from their custody and placed in foster care. Despite efforts from both sides of the extended family to gain custody, the state deemed foster care to be the most suitable option to ensure the children's safety and well-being. Community outrage and advocacy. Emani's story resonated deeply with the public. Community members and advocates for child welfare expressed outrage at the numerous missed opportunities to save her. The failure of Child Protective Services, CPS, to act decisively despite repeated reports of abuse became a focal point of criticism. Many questioned how a child could fall through the cracks of a system designed to protect her. This outrage fueled calls for systemic reform. Advocacy groups pushed for changes in how child abuse cases are handled, emphasizing the need for better training for CPS workers, improved coordination between agencies, and stricter accountability measures. In Georgia, where Emani's case occurred, lawmakers introduced proposals to strengthen the state's child welfare policies. A legacy of change. While no amount of reform can undo the tragedy of Emani's death, her story has inspired tangible changes aimed at preventing similar cases in the future. Among these changes were enhanced CPS training. Social workers received additional training on identifying and responding to signs of severe neglect and abuse, ensuring that no report is dismissed without thorough investigation. Improved reporting systems. New measures were implemented to streamline the reporting and tracking of child abuse cases, allowing for quicker responses and better communication between agencies. Community education programs. Initiatives were launched to educate the public on recognizing and reporting child abuse, empowering neighbors, teachers, and other community members to act as the first line of defense for vulnerable children. Remembering Emani? In the years following her death, efforts were made to preserve Emani's memory. Local organizations held vigils and awareness events in her honor, using her story as a rallying cry for change. Scholarships and donations were established in her name to support children in foster care, ensuring that her legacy would help others avoid the same fate. A call to action. Emani's story serves as a heartbreaking reminder of the importance of vigilance and compassion in protecting vulnerable children. It underscores the critical need for individuals and institutions to take every report of abuse seriously and to act swiftly to intervene. The systemic failures in Emani's case, from law enforcement to child protection services, highlight the devastating consequences of inaction. Her death also calls on communities to adopt a proactive stance, recognizing the signs of abuse, speaking up when something feels wrong, and demanding accountability from authorities are all essential steps in safeguarding children. The changes inspired by Emani's story show that progress is possible, but they also remind us that vigilance must be ongoing. A somber legacy. Emani Moss's life was cut tragically short, but her story continues to resonate as a powerful cautionary tale. It is a call to action for a society that failed her, urging everyone to do better for the children who depend on adults for safety and care. Through reforms, advocacy, and education, Emani's legacy lives on, a poignant reminder of the work still needed to ensure that no child suffers as she did. Part 7. Conclusion. Emani Moss's story is one of heartbreak, loss, and profound failure. A tragedy that began in plain sight yet unfolded to devastating consequences. Her life, though brief, highlights the dangers of systemic neglect and the critical role that vigilance and compassion must play in protecting children. Reflecting on the failures. The death of Emani Moss exposed glaring flaws in the systems designed to safeguard children. Despite numerous red flags, visible injuries, repeated reports to Child Protective Services, CPS, and the desperate pleas of a young child, she was tragically ignored. This case underscores how unchecked bureaucracy and a lack of proper training among authorities can allow preventable tragedies to occur. Emani's death was preventable. The warning signs were unmistakable, and efforts to save her came from many corners: teachers, neighbors, and family members. Yet, systemic inertia and inaction sealed her fate. Her case begs us to ask, how many children like Emani are out there, unseen and unheard? What immediate changes can we implement to make sure no child is ever abandoned by the systems meant to protect them? A call to action. Emani's legacy lies not only in the tragedy of her story, but also in the reforms and awareness it has sparked. Her case compels us to reimagine child welfare systems, ensuring they are equipped to act decisively and compassionately in safeguarding at-risk children. For policymakers, strengthen laws and regulations to ensure timely and effective interventions in child abuse cases. Invest in resources for CPS and foster care systems to better serve at-risk children. For educators and community members, stay alert to signs of abuse and neglect. Speak up and persist when something seems wrong. Your vigilance can save a life. For society as a whole, foster a culture of care and accountability. Recognize that the protection of children is a collective responsibility, one that transcends individual households and extends to communities and nations. A legacy of hope. While Emani's life ended in tragedy, her story has left an indelible mark on those who hear it. Efforts to honor her memory, through advocacy, scholarships, and community initiatives, serve as a beacon of hope for other children who might be at risk. Her story has sparked dialogue, driven reforms, and inspired individuals to take action. Emani's voice may have been silenced, but her story continues to speak volumes. It calls on all of us to do better, to listen, to act, and to protect. It reminds us that every child deserves a chance to thrive, free from fear and harm. And it challenges us to ensure that Emani's suffering was not in vain. Looking ahead. The work to protect children, like Emani, is far from over. Her story remains a stark reminder of the cost of inaction, but also serves as a testament to the power of reform and advocacy. By continuing this fight, we can ensure that no child's cries for help are ever ignored again.